not afraid to say the word quiet, even in the hospital setting. Well, good morning and hello. This is Bobby, a chaplain resident at a Level 1 Regional Trauma Center, checking in for day in the life of a chaplain resident. Well, it seems we might have a little bit of a gloomy on-call shift today. It's a rainy day. So my hope is that means things will be a little bit slower, and I don't believe in superstition. So I know that saying that early in the morning might mean a little something to some folks, especially in the healthcare or the hospital setting, but I'm not afraid to say those things. I don't say them around staff because it makes staff anxious, but I'm not afraid to say the Q word, not afraid to say the word quiet, even in the hospital setting. But I hope today is going to be a great day as we have an on-call shift, open to the possibilities of what that will mean for me today and my chaplain resident group, as we provide spiritual care and services here at a Level 1 Trauma Center. Well, here it is late afternoon, and just wanted to take a little bit and check in, let you know how today is going so far. This morning when I said today I was hoping it would be a quiet day, has actually proven fairly true. We had some normal routine conferences and calls, consultations from nurses and families and patients, just kind of the normal work that we do as chaplains, and it's been great. But things have been pretty calm as far as when it comes to crisis intervention and traumas and codes and those sort of things. And I just wanted to take a moment and appreciate the grace that comes in that. I learned a long time ago not to stir up conversations and stir up work when there is no work. Not saying that I just sit around and do nothing. I still go about the regular work that there is, but I don't also try to get stressed out or worried when things aren't going at a certain pace that I might think that I want. There is grace in the quiet. There is grace in the normal and in the regular times of life. There's grace in the regular work that I do as a chaplain, as I spend time with patients, with families, with staff, and the many different functions and responsibilities that we serve in a regular basis at a Level 1 Trauma Center. Those things range from all kinds of conversations, all kinds of moments, from the mundane, the simple, all the way up to the most devastating and the most difficult. Really, the grace is what I wanted to talk about today, the gift, the free gift. As someone who comes from a Christian background, I know that that grace comes from God. Grace is God's action towards us. It is unmerited favor and generosity given to us by God as a gift. Grace comes without requirements. It comes without expectations. Grace is pure goodness given by God as God sees fit. There's nothing that you can do to earn grace. There's nothing that you can do to stop grace. A couple of years ago, as I began my journey as a chaplain doing an intern unit, I struggled a lot with grace. As I reflected with my supervisor and in my peer group, I began to realize out loud with my supervisor particularly that I struggled a lot with receiving God's grace. That in a lot of ways I was obsessed, or I overfunctioned in many kinds of ways as a way to prove that I deserved God's love. That overfunctioning in a lot of ways was me saying to God and to others that I'm good enough, or that I deserve it, or I've earned whatever it is that I have. What I really needed to realize is that everything that I have in my life is a gift. And for me, everything that I have and that I get to experience is a gift from God. And so that theological perspective really began to help me develop a sense of gratitude towards God's grace. So God's grace is what was given to me in so many circumstances in my life. And I have clear testimony and can point to all kinds of examples of God's grace. I'm blessed with having triplet girls who are 11 years old. I didn't do anything to be blessed with triplets. It's grace. I'm blessed with a wife who loves me unconditionally and generously, more than I even deserve. That's God's grace through her and her grace towards me as she represents God's grace towards me. I was born into a family that cared for me and provided for me in so many ways. My mom and my dad are gifts. I didn't choose my mom or my dad, right? Those are graces and gifts from God in that sense. And all that they gave and provided for me really is God's grace in action again. So many circumstances and events and things that have happened in my life really are a result of God's goodness, God's grace, and His generosity, His love towards me. My response back to God's grace as I begin to think about all the things that God has given towards me, my response back is gratitude. It is a recognition of that grace. As I've come to realize in the original language that grace and gratitude are directly related, that gratitude is a way for us to give grace back, or a way for us to both receive the grace but also transmit the grace as we get to share that grace, that goodness that God has given us to others. We share it for ourselves, we get to enjoy that, and we also get to share that with others. That's what gratitude is all about. It is a state of mind. It's a sense of being and doing. It's an emotional impact, but it's really it's an action in a lot of ways too. It's not an over-functioning. It's really an undoing, and that's really what I've begun to work on and begun to get to experience and really revel in that grace that God has given me and the gratitude that I experience back. A specific way and maybe an interesting way for me to talk about this and think about this as a chaplain from my perspective at this trauma hospital is we get called into end-of-life situations all the time, into codes and what the hospital calls comfort care decision, which is when a patient has gotten to the point where they make a decision towards comfort-focused measures, comfort-focused goals, instead of curative treatments. And I was used to that in hospice as I served in the hospice situation for 18 months. Those were all comfort-focused care decisions. In the hospital setting, we get involved in those conversations when someone decides or they're at the point where they need to go to a comfort-focused care. What's really a grace and really a beautiful moment for us in those conversations where we get to be a part of those end-of-life conversations. As a hospice chaplain and now as a hospital chaplain, there's grace in those end-of-life moments where you get to experience someone's last moments. I was just talking to a group of pediatric nurses a couple of days ago. We were invited to come in and talk about self-care during end-of-life situations. And the nurse educator said that she wanted us as chaplains to talk about self-care before, during, and then after those end-of-life situations, which in her words, that their nurses as pediatric nurses didn't have a whole lot of experience in on average, right? There's not a lot of deaths when it comes to pediatric cases, but when they are, they're especially meaningful, especially devastating in a lot of ways, especially impactful for nurses. And so I talked about different strategies, different ways that they could take care of themselves before, during, and after those end-of-life conversations. The biggest thing that I said to them is as they go into those end-of-life situations and those conversations, those care moments, if they would see that care as a grace, if they would see that opportunity to care as a gift. And what I meant by that, and what I told them, what I see in those end-of-life situations too, is to say, this is an incredibly sacred and special, holy moment for this patient and family who is dying. Maybe their last minutes, their last moments, their last words, their last emotions. And so there's some sacredness, right? There's some specialness in those moments. For me to come into it and see it as a gift is I get to experience that with them. I get to share in that gift. And it being a gift means it is what it is. What is happening is what is happening. And so realizing that, yes, there may be some frustrations or some lingering moments or some unanswered questions in that, but what happens in that time can be good. What happens in those last moments and in those end-of-life situations can be a gift to the patient, to the family, to the care team as well. So what if we approach those circumstances, those moments, as gifts? Just a couple of years ago, I went through the most difficult experience that I've ever gone through in my adult life and really in my vocation, in my calling. I realized as a staff member at the local church where I was serving that my time had come to an end. That in spite of everything that I had tried and done and how much I wanted it to change and I wanted it to be different, that I was at a time and a place where it was time for me to move on. And God was calling me on to some other new, different experience. What was scary for me is that it was very much going to be a leap of faith for me to put in a resignation and say, I no longer can stay here. I didn't know what was next. So that was scary for me and my family. It was also a very difficult moment for us because it was personal for my wife and myself. And without going into all those details and really sharing all that for the whole world to hear, because it's still deeply personal, I want to say that there was grace in that moment, in that decision that we realized we had to leave. Was it painful? I cannot begin to describe how painful it was for my wife, especially because it was aimed at her, and then for myself to navigate that alongside her as someone who cared for her, who had been hurt so deeply by a church that we cared so much about. We realized it was time for us to move on. When I made that decision public that we were resigning and I was moving on, a pastor mentor of mine from a long time ago gave me a call. He still had my phone number, which was an incredible blessing. He gave me a call and he said to me, one day you'll be able to thank God for this moment. One day you'll be able to thank God for this coming to an end. Because if you're honest with yourself, this was a dead end for you. If you're honest with yourself, you were beginning to rot on the inside spiritually. I had the boldness and the braveness to be able to say to him on that phone call, you're right. Honestly, you're right. I knew for years going up to that things were souring and things weren't going to get better, but I didn't know how to get out. I didn't know what was next. I was scared in some ways and I was waiting on something. God has a way of moving us even when we're not ready to be moved. I still had a choice in that. I could have stayed and I could have rotted. I could have been very disgruntled and very angry and just sat in that forever, maybe for the rest of my life. Who knows what could have happened or what would have happened, but what I knew, it was time for me to go and move on. It really is true, though, as I look back and reflect on what happened, what could have happened, what would have happened, what might have happened. There's grace in the fact that I realized I needed to move on. And I do thank God for what happened, as painful as it was, as hard as it was for our family, that God was there and God provided in the midst of it all. Again, there was grace. I wonder how much there's grace for you today, how much you realize that there is grace for you today. There is excessive, abundant, incredible grace. There's a story in the Synoptic Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke of a woman who comes and anoints Jesus' feet with a very expensive ointment. John's Gospel tells a very similar story, and John names this person as Mary. In this story in the Synoptic Gospels, we see this woman who had been living a sinful life break this bottle of perfume onto the feet of Jesus and anoint him for burial. if this woman is Mary or if this happened again in a different way and it was not Mary. Regardless, what's important here is that the interaction that happens is an example of God's grace as I think about it. Here we have this very expensive perfume that this person used to anoint the feet of Jesus. Typically, this perfume would have been an anointing oil for the purpose of burial. And of course, it's not ironic that this story occurs, this interaction occurs pretty close to the point where Jesus is going to be betrayed and crucified, killed. And so in the Gospels, this functions as a preparation for burial for Jesus. The disciples get angry. It's a different disciple, different interaction in each of the Gospels, but what's important is they are angry at the excessive action of this woman to waste this perfume on Jesus. In one case, it's why wasn't this sold and the money given to the poor? Or why was this such a waste of such an expensive thing? It could have been used for different circumstances. In each of the Gospels, Jesus responds a little bit differently, but basically his response is, this woman did what needed to be done, and it was good. Even in spite of the excessiveness of what she did and potentially the wastefulness of the amount of perfume that she used, in all cases, it was the entire canister, it was the entire vessel, the entire flask of this really expensive perfume. Jesus says that what she did was good. And in Matthew's gospel, Jesus said that what she did was beautiful. When I think about that, that's God's grace. That's God pouring out excessively. Paul talks about God's lavish grace upon us. And that is the way that we get to respond as well. We get to receive that lavish grace. We also get to be that lavish grace to others who don't deserve it, who haven't earned it, and who haven't done anything worthy of it. That's what makes it grace, is that it really has nothing to do with worthiness. It's a gift that someone is given. It's a gift that someone receives. That's the grace that happens in that. A way for me to contextualize this and say this with people kind of in my own life is to talk about what it's like for me to be a dad of triplet girls. My girls love playing with glitter. In fact, we limit where they can play with glitter. And for a while, there was a rule that it could only be in one room. In fact, my mom had a rule at her house where they weren't allowed to play with glitter really at all. I believe God's grace is a lot like glitter. It's excessive. It gets everywhere. It's excessive. It clings to you. And just when you think you've gotten all of it off of you, you find it later on. What's really cool too about thinking about glitter is that if you rub up too close to someone else or to something else, it transfers from you to that other person or to that other thing as well. God's grace is a lot like glitter. It gets everywhere. It is excessive. It shows up on us. And when we rub up against others, it transfers to them as well. My, how we all could be God's grace, God's glitter to other people. It makes me excited thinking about that. It rejuvenates me. It inspires my soul and encourages me to want to be God's conduit of glitter, God's conduit of grace, because I know that it's not my own capacity, it's not my own energy that gets to express that grace. It's God's movement to me, in me, and through me to others. And that's invigorating. That's rejuvenating. As I talk to those nurses about the gift of being with someone in an end-of-life situation, and I think about that as well, if I'm caring for my soul and connecting myself to God and allowing God to renew me, both physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, all of those things, then I can be that conduit of grace and love to that person, even when they're going through some of the most terrible moments of their lives, some of the saddest moments of their lives. Yes, they may be painful. Yes, they may be difficult, but there's grace in those conversations. There's grace in those times. Even when we lose someone, there's grace in that sadness. There's grace of God present, meeting us right where we are, pouring out lavishly upon us, not only what we want, but what we truly, deeply need down on the inside. That's the grace that I get to experience as a follower of Jesus, as someone who's called to be a conduit of grace to others. And that's just not my special work as a chaplain. That's everyone's special work as a follower of Christ, to be that conduit of grace. As God has loved us, so too do we love others. My encouragement to you today is to go forth and be that conduit of grace, that blessing, that excessive glitter-like grace of God poured out, spread to others. Receive it for yourself, not because of your own merit, because what you have done or what you haven't done or how you've messed up, but because it's a gift, because it's God's free gift of love to you. And so give that to others. So express that to others and be encouraged today, my friends. God loves you, friends. Receive that grace for yourself today and be that conduit of grace to others. May God bless you. Until we meet again, go in grace. Amen.